Slavery was the backbone of the Roman world. From the bustling streets of Rome to the quiet villas of the countryside, slaves were everywhere. They tilled the fields, built the aqueducts, educated the children of senators, and entertained the crowds in bloody spectacles. But behind this vast system lies a question rarely asked. How much did a Roman slave actually cost? The answer is not simple. Prices depended on supply and demand, skill, origin, gender, and even the turbulence of Rome's wars. To uncover it, we must travel through markets, battlefields, and estates, where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, and where fortunes were made or lost on the value of a single slave. The slave market of Rome. Imagine stepping into the bustling Roman forum at the height of the empire. Traders shout out prices for olive oil, wine, pottery, and spices, but behind the noise of commerce lies another, darker market. Beneath the marble arches and towering temples, human beings are displayed on raised platforms. Men, women, and even children stand silently, eyes lowered as crowds circle them. Around their necks hang wooden placards describing their supposed value. Strong worker, age 18, knows Greek, never ran away. Wealthy Romans walk by, appraising them as if they were livestock. Buyers tug at arms to test muscle, pry open mouths to check teeth, and trace old scars to measure past resistance. Some whisper about beauty, others about strength or obedience. The air is thick with calculation, not of dignity, but of profit. And then, with the strike of an auctioneer's hammer, a fate is sealed. For one person, it might be the mines, for another the household, for others still the gladiator's arena. In Rome, a single bid determined not just a price, but an entire destiny. The price of an ordinary slave. The most common slaves, unskilled laborers captured in wars or born into bondage, were the cheapest. Records suggest that in the late Republic, a standard unskilled slave could cost anywhere from 500 to 2,000 sesterces. To put that in perspective, a Roman legionary earned around 900 sesterces a year. A loaf of bread cost about half a sestertius. So, buying even the cheapest slave was an enormous investment, roughly equivalent to purchasing a modern car. For poorer Romans, ownership was out of reach, but for wealthy landowners, merchants, and senators, these purchases multiplied. A single estate might employ hundreds. Skilled slaves, an expensive investment. Not all slaves were equal. A slave who could read, write, or count was worth far more than a farm laborer. Greek slaves in particular commanded premium prices. Their reputation as teachers, philosophers, and secretaries made them highly desirable. A skilled Greek tutor could cost 20,000 sesterces or more, a fortune. For comparison, that was more than 20 years' salary for a Roman soldier. Rich families flaunted their wealth by buying not one, but several tutors to educate their children in grammar, rhetoric, and music. Doctors, accountants, and craftsmen also fetched high prices. A skilled physician slave might sell for 30,000 to 40,000 sesterces, while an architect capable of overseeing construction projects could reach similar sums. These slaves were treated not as expendable labor, but as valuable assets, investments that could increase a household's prestige and income. The exotic factor slaves in Rome were not priced equally. Their origins and appearances carried enormous weight in determining their market value. Buyers came with stereotypes already in mind, and those labels often meant the difference between a cheap laborer and a prized possession. Gauls and Germans, for example, were usually considered physically strong, well-suited for hard labor. But their reputation for being wild and rebellious made them less desirable for domestic service. As a result, they sold for lower prices, often destined for the fields, quarries, or mines where survival was short. Thracians, on the other hand, had a reputation for ferocity. Their strength and battle hardiness made them prime candidates for gladiatorial training, which raised their price significantly. Because in the arena, a single skilled fighter could generate immense profits. At the top of the market stood the Greeks. Known for their education, literacy, and culture, they became tutors, advisors, and physicians, serving Rome's elite families. Their knowledge made them among the most expensive slaves. Syrians and Egyptians were also in demand, often sold into households where their exotic features were seen as a status symbol. Wealthy Romans paid extra for these slaves, eager to display cosmopolitan diversity within their villas. Women and children. In the Roman slave markets, women were typically priced lower than men, as brute strength was highly valued for farming, mining, and construction. Yet the picture was more complicated. Skilled women, those trained in weaving fine cloth, midwifery, medicine, or music, could fetch far higher prices as their talents directly served elite Roman households. But tragically, many young women were purchased for sexual exploitation. The demand for concubines was constant, and in such cases beauty, youth, and charm could make a single woman worth more than an able-bodied male laborer. For wealthy Romans, such purchases were not just about pleasure, but also about prestige, flaunting their ability to own and control what others could not. Children, by contrast, were the cheapest lives sold. A boy or girl might cost only a few hundred sesterces, since they required years of feeding and training before becoming useful. War and the price of human lives. The cost of slaves fluctuated wildly depending on war. Every Roman conquest flooded the market with new captives. After Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, it's said that hundreds of thousands of Gauls were sold into slavery. With supply so high, prices crashed. A slave could be purchased for the price of a donkey. But, in times of peace, scarcity drove prices upward again. Families who had lost slaves through death, escape, or rebellion had to pay dearly to replace them. For Rome's elite, this was no obstacle. For smaller farmers, it could mean ruin. The price of gladiators. Few slaves were as famous or as expensive as gladiators. A trained gladiator could cost 15,000 sesterces or more, especially if he had victories to his name. Star gladiators, much like modern athletes, could become worth fortunes, generating revenue for their owners through performances and wagers. Yet, gladiators were also high-risk investments. One fight could end in death, reducing thousands of sesterces to nothing. Owners often had to weigh the thrill of profit against the danger of loss. Household slaves versus field slaves. The divide between domestic and rural slaves was stark. Household slaves, those who cooked, cleaned, educated, and served meals, were more expensive, as they were constantly seen by visitors and reflected the wealth of their owners. Field slaves, by contrast, were cheaper, but often worked in brutal conditions. On large estates, gangs of slaves labored under overseers, producing the grain, wine, and olive oil that sustained Rome. Their lives were short, their deaths quickly replaced by new purchases. Maintenance costs. Buying a slave in Rome was never the end of the transaction. It was the beginning of an investment. Once purchased, a master had to shoulder the ongoing costs of keeping that human property alive and functional. Historical estimates suggest that maintaining a single slave required between 200 and 300 sesterces annually for food, clothing, and basic shelter. Bread, olive oil, and a coarse porridge were staples of a slave's diet, while clothing was often rough wool garments that had to last for years. Housing varied dramatically. Field slaves might sleep in cramped barracks or even barns, while household slaves lived closer to the villa, though always under their master's watch. The human cost behind every number lies tragedy. These prices reveal how the Romans reduced human beings into units of economic value. Children sold away from mothers. Families broken by auctions. Talented men and women stripped of freedom and turned into commodities. The cost of a slave was not just measured in sesterces. It was measured in the silence of those who lost their voices, the generations scarred by bondage, and the empire built on their suffering. Decline of the slave economy. As the empire aged, the economics of slavery began to shift. With fewer conquests, the supply of slaves dwindled, prices rose, and some Romans began to turn to tenant farming and wage labor instead. The very foundations of Rome's slave economy began to crack. By late antiquity, slavery had not disappeared, but it had changed, foreshadowing the medieval systems of serfdom to come. The price of humanity. So, how much did a Roman slave cost? The answer ranges from a few hundred sesterces for a child to tens of thousands for a skilled Greek tutor or gladiator. But the true price was far greater: the destruction of freedom, dignity, and family. Rome's grandeur, its aqueducts, armies, and marble forums, was paid for in human lives. And while the numbers give us insight into the economics of slavery, they also force us to confront the darker truth: that an empire's glory was built on the backs of those who had no choice.